Welcome back to the Connected podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you an extraordinary collection in which some incredible students take the driver's seat and host dynamic conversations with professionals from across the higher education sector, discussing the vital topic of student belonging. Next up, we have Felicity Rush. Felicity is joined today by Kelly Jeffery, an engagement manager at Keele University. Kelly is part of a research group looking at how to support autistic learners in higher education.
To kick it off, could you tell me about your project and sort of what's inspired your focus on this topic?
Yeah, so Autistic Voices in Higher Education is a large project that encompasses a couple of different studies so far. The first of which was Autistic Voices in Geoscience, and the second we're currently collecting data for, which is Autistic Voices in Higher Education, Work-Based Learning. The principal investigator, Dr. Adam Jeffery, also at Keele, is autistic, and he's got a range of experiences of participating in higher education as an autistic learner, undergrad, postgrad researcher, staff. I've also worked in various disability and student support roles, both in higher and further education. Part of the driver for me was to address the attainment gap for learners with social and communication impairments in higher education. And following a range of conversations with lots of other people, including Dr. Steve Rogers at Keele, who's heavily involved in geoscience education, Professor Julie Hume, who's a researcher in disability at Nottingham Trent, and Dr. Mark Lucarini in Edinburgh, among a few others, we noticed that autistic learners in higher education seem to be being treated differently to most other student groups. And we wanted to make a difference and give autistic learners the opportunity to be represented within the discussions. So we decided to establish the research group, gather the lived experiences of autistic learners in higher education with a view to raising awareness and some of the barriers that they face on a daily basis.
Wow, that's quite an in-depth project then. And as an autistic person myself, I think that it's so important to address these things.
Thank you.
So it gathers the lived experience of autistic students. Um, in more of the context of belonging, why is capturing these sort of personal narratives so important for shaping the support within the higher education industry?
Yeah, we think that sharing lived experiences is the key in most situations. It's often easy to get lost in statistics and forget you're dealing with human beings. Each individual has very different needs, and it's easy to see the word autistic and just group every learner together as, oh, they're autistic. These umbrella solutions will help support them in higher education. Um, but actually, each individual is very different. We always say when you've met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. And whilst they can have some shared traits, everyone is individual. Their support needs need to be specifically tailored to their needs. In terms of student belonging, a number of conferences I've attended, one of the key things has been students listen to students. The sharing of student experiences is one of the biggest drivers for students to kind of learn and develop as well. So that was another key we wanted to get in there. And we want to produce research which uses the actual lived experiences of our participants and puts their voices in the middle of the discussion, adhering to the idea of nothing about us without us. We wanted to show that these are human beings who are asking you for help, you for support, and they just want understanding, rather than a minority defined by a classificatory term who just need to be managed.
So I've heard a bit about nothing about us without us. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, just for sort of viewer context?
Yeah, so the idea is that instead of, I guess in this case, instead of neurotypical individuals doing a study, for want of a better word, on autistic learners or about autistic learners and kind of putting their ideas and their how they think things should be
Yeah.
on them. Instead, the idea of nothing about us without us is that you actually get the autistic participants involved from the beginning. Instead of saying, I think they need this, you speak to them and get them to say, we really need support in this, or we found this. You get them involved in the data collection, you get them involved in the co-creation of any resources going forwards. They are part of the study, and also the team as well as a neurodiverse team. So again, we've got that element of nothing about us without us on that level as well.
Brilliant. So, in terms of barriers, what sorts of barriers are to belonging and in general are autistic students typically facing in higher education, and how might these challenges differ from the neurotypical students' experience?
So from the study so far, we've learned that's a huge range of challenges, some of which are quite broad, some very specific. For example, it could be a physical space in which learning is happening. Universities typically of late like to make big new shiny buildings that have got bright lights and shiny white floors, and that's great. But for certain learners, such as those with autistic traits, the experience of sensory difficulties can make those kinds of buildings so bright, so echoey, so shiny that the autistic learner is actually fighting a constant battle to exist in that space before you're even trying to then ask them to learn something or engage with learning. And it can be very draining on their energy. Some learners we spoke to emphasise the importance of clarity of instructions, describing times when they were made to feel like an awkward or defiant person, specifically like they were ignoring rules when actually they were desperately trying to decipher the instructions and complete them accurately. Some aspects of HE also involve field trips. So as a learner, you're being plucked from your usual routine and environment and potentially dropped into an environment that's completely alien to you, where you're expected to potentially be out for most of the day, working in groups, possibly then engaging in evening sessions, sharing accommodation. And quite often, the autistic learners therefore get no time to recharge and end up completely exhausted on these trips. They also might not get access to the food they'd normally eat. So with autistic people, we often find they have specific safe foods. And one of the quotes that we had from one of the learners was about filling their luggage when they go on field work with crackers because that's their safe food. They don't know what they're going to get on field work, so they feel they have to take their safe food with them. So it sort of adds a lot of levels that potentially a neurotypical learner wouldn't necessarily have to deal with. They've also reported genuine cases of hostility. I won't repeat the quotes on air because some of them are really quite horrifying.
Yeah.
But some of the language in this day and age still that's being used towards the autistic learners that we spoke to, it wouldn't be tolerated across most other groups, and it was really quite upsetting to hear, really. I know they are very specific examples. I guess more broadly, there's an issue with the challenge of masking. So a lot of autistic learners mask, which is a form of social camouflage. They feel obliged to adopt this form of social camouflage to try and fit into a society who doesn't necessarily accept them for who they are. Essentially, like they're having to pretend to be someone they're not. And a lot of autistic learners have multiple masks depending on what audience they are with. It can lead to complete exhaustion. It can lead to a sense of losing their true self. One example, a quote from the learners we spoke to, they said, "I've been masking for most of my life in order to survive in social situations, and this has caused a lot of difficulty with my sense of self." And another learner said, "It's easier to appear normal." So that's some of the sort of the specific and the more general difficulties that we encountered.
Yeah, it's always good to have specific examples. I did my dissertation, in fact, on masking in autistic
Yeah,
women specifically, and obviously I found similar things to you in that it's hugely impactful on sense of self. And obviously, when you move away to uni, quite often you need to find who you are because you're now not living with your parents. You're living potentially in a different county, different city. Everything's very different. So I'm really pleased that the project sort of brings in that element of the lived experience. So
thank you.
one of your goals is to inform staff training and policy. So what do you think this will inspire in higher education in terms of changes, developments? Are there any strategies or programs that institutions can implement?
So I think one of the key things that we're hoping will happen, and one of the key things to do going forward, is just to include autistic people in discussions. Ask them, what do you need? Historically, I think a lot of decisions tend to be made by neurotypical people with limited consultation with the actual individuals who are living this day to day. Ultimately, I think the key is to listen to the learner's needs and address them with understanding. We've picked up on tiny changes which cost practically nothing to implement can make a huge difference to autistic learners' sense of belonging and their experience. For example, higher education is rightly moving away from the classic didactic teaching approaches and diversifying the classroom to include more interactive teaching, which is great, but it could introduce significant challenges to learners with social and communication difficulties. So, an example would be if you're doing a group-based classroom activity, instead of putting people into groups, why not ask the learners to pair up or buddy up and then pop those buddies together into groups?
Yeah.
That way you're still getting the advantages of the group work, but the autistic learner, their needs have been considered and they'll hopefully know at least one person in the group who they're relatively comfortable with. It gives them a better chance of engaging with the learning. And again, that tiny tweak, it shouldn't really hinder anyone else's learning, but it can make a massive difference for the autistic learner. And then beyond the classroom at the institutional level, the biggest outcome of our conversations with autistic students was a request for training. They felt that both the staff and their peers would benefit from training. They wanted people who were designing and delivering their learning and their peers to be trained in what autism actually is. Not forgetting some people still think autism is an illness which needs to be cured. So
Yeah.
they felt that awareness is crucial. One of the quotes we had from one of the learners was actually, "We want to teach people that autism is not an illness." And I think that's a really key thing, just awareness and training.
Yeah. So the awarding gap and the retention of autistic students within the project are mentioned as quite major concerns. What does
Yeah.
that gap look like, and why is it such a critical issue?
Yeah. So when you look at the awarding gap, so the difference in top degrees awarded, a good degree being classified as an outcome of a 2-1 or a first.
Mhm.
Generally looking at it, the trend for disabled learners as a whole seems to be getting better. And actually, a few years back there was an awarding gap, and that has slowly closed. But it's only in about past 5 or 6 years that they've been splitting disability into different criteria and actually having a closer look at those different groups of learners with different disabilities and how the awarding gap is is represented for them. When you then look at that, whilst mostly disabilities, the awarding gap is closing. And in fact, for some disabilities, such as mental health, the awarding gap has actually closed so much that it now appears that those with a mental health difficulty are actually achieving better grades than a student with no additional needs. Looking at the social and communication category, that awarding gap hasn't yet closed. So the trend is for most of the other disabilities that awarding gap is closing, whereas the social and communication one has stayed relatively consistently, indicating that those with social and communication difficulties are less likely to get a good degree, as in a 2-1 or a first overall in higher education. And that was something that sort of jumped out at us, and we sort of said, well, we want to investigate that more. Why? Clearly, a lot of good work is being done to close the awarding gap overall for disabled learners, and that's fantastic. But whatever's being done clearly isn't working as well for those learners with social and communication difficulties. And we kind of wanted to dig a bit deeper into, well, why and how can we help that awarding gap close as well?
Yeah, yeah. No, it seems sometimes because it's not a disability that can be necessarily seen
Yeah,
that people will gloss over it or think, well, you present as typical and I can't see anything wrong with you, so there must be nothing wrong with you, which
yeah.
obviously is entirely wrong.
Yeah, it is. We've actually had participants say that they've had people say to them, well, I don't think you're autistic. And they've sort of said, but I've got a diagnosis just because I'm good at masking, or I'm, trying my hardest to fit in with what you guys want me to be. It, it doesn't mean I'm not autistic. And you saying I don't think you're autistic actually can be quite hurtful,
Yeah.
as well to them.
Yeah. It's a challenge, I think. So you talked about the World Cafe method. So what is the World Cafe method? Why was it chosen?
So the World Cafe method is a great way of getting lived experiences from your participants. Quite often it would be um, sort of either an in-person or an synchronous event that either on Teams or physically in person, you had a number of people in a room and you ask them questions and get their answers, which is great, but can be very daunting to autistic people because it is an inherently social
Yeah.
form of data collection. So we wanted to take the best of the World Cafe approach, but adapt it so it worked for autistic people. Professor Julie Hume, who is part of the group over at Nottingham Trent, her research group have come up with an asynchronous version of the World Cafe method. Um, Basically using a chat platform commonly used for gaming, Discord. I'm not sure if you've heard of
Ah,
Discord
yes.
before. A lot of gamers use it to kind of chat or have video calls and things while they're playing games. So we thought we'd use that platform. We made it so it's only a chat platform, so nobody could, have video calls or verbal calls. It was all just chat function. We had, for the Autistic Voices in Geoscience, 40 participants split across 4 rooms. They were all anonymous. They all had to have anonymous images as well, so no one could be identifiable. And then across the course of 3 weeks, we released 2 to 3 questions per day. The participant could go in and answer them as they were released, or they could just perhaps pop in once a week and answer the previous week's questions. They could also respond to each other's answers if they'd, said something that really resonated. They could say, "Oh yes, I've got an experience of that too," and kind of engage with each other, but on that asynchronous level. And it worked really well. And some of the feedback we had from the participants was that they'd really enjoyed being in a space where they could talk to other people with similar lived experiences, but they could do it kind of at their own time, at their own pace. The rooms were open for 4 weeks in total. So it gave people chance to participate in their own time at a time of day of their choosing that fitted with their needs.
Ah. So some support suggestions obviously would have come out of this research. Can you share a few of the most impactful ones that institutions might need to consider implementing quite soon?
Yeah, some of the most surprising and powerful themes that came out were how very self-reflective the participants were.
Yeah.
Nobody knows in as much detail what works or doesn't work for the autistic learners than the autistic learners themselves. They were incredibly self-aware. They knew all their strengths and weaknesses and challenges, and kind of reinforced the whole when you've met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. It was powerful how much they had to say as soon as they had a platform to do so as well. And it kind of showed us how little because their voices aren't being heard, because the environments don't exist for them to be heard. In terms of specific support suggestions that came out of the research, I'd say autism awareness for all was a big one. Training for all staff and learners from a sympathetic source, so either from the National Autistic Society or from writers, speakers, creators, authors, trainers who are themselves autistic and offer training. And the key message would be listen and be understanding. Don't jump to conclusions about someone. They were probably the most sort of powerful things that came from the research.
Yeah. It's a strong message to send, particularly when you use autistic voices, because obviously historically we've been spoken over, spoken for. Yeah, it's a lovely approach to use when you go directly to the source rather than what I'd call hearsay.
Yeah.
So, and awareness, obviously, within the project is a massive part, like we've said. How can unis do a better job of not just supporting autistic students, but also creating that culture that understands neurodivergence? Obviously, we've discussed some of the experiences on here.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to create a space in which the autistic learners in this example are comfortable to share their voice. Um, like I said, a lot of them said they really enjoyed speaking to other autistic people as part of the research in the Discord groups. So anything that can facilitate that. Autistic learners generally are less likely to be the ones that come forward, raise issues. They're the ones that are going to slip under the radar. Um, Something we're getting from the research for the work-based learning that we're currently collecting data as we're speaking. A lot of them are saying it wasn't until they learnt to self-advocate that things became more manageable. So I think it's about giving them a platform to do that as soon as possible. Part of that will be through just training and awareness generally, but part of that will also be giving them a space, whether it be an autistic learner support group, whether it be that perhaps some of our autistic learners in the final year of their degrees will help with induction events and things like that to help get autistic learners the space they need to be able to voice how they feel and what they need. A lot of them said once they'd accessed student support or disability support at their institutions, they had a lot easier time, but it took them a long time to access it because they weren't jumping up saying, hey, I need support. They kind of slip under the radar. I think listening and understanding, one of the major parts of the research was we asked, what messages do you want us to send to the rest of the higher education community on your behalf? And one of the responses we got, I will read it to you because it's a beautiful quote, was, please be patient with me and take a bit of time to understand me. I may seem a little withdrawn and awkward at first, but that's because I experience and process the world differently to most people. I may not have a loud personality and it may not be obvious at first, but I am passionate about my interests and always strive to work to the best of my ability with things that are important to me. Please understand that my needs may not be obvious at first, and I may not seem to need support all the time, but it is very necessary to have support, and I wouldn't lie about something I need. And finally, please be kind and know that we are also people wanting to learn and enjoy university, and that I am really passionate about exploring and expanding my knowledge in my special interest alongside others who also love the subject. And we just thought that was the perfect summary, straight from one of our participants' mouths, that quote, this is what we want the higher education community to hear.
That was so powerful. Thank you.
No problem. We were
So,
just really lucky that they were so honest and so open
of
in the
course.
discussions.
Yeah, you must have created a lovely platform for them to feel able to do this on.
Thank you.
So, looking ahead, what is next for the project, Autistic Voices in Higher Education, and how can our listeners or institutions listening get involved or learn more about it?
Okay, so there's a couple of things from the Autistic Voices in Geoscience, which is the first study that we did. The results of the study are currently being submitted for publication, so we're hoping that there'll be a paper out in the next few months.
Oh,
They're also being presented at a range of conferences, both national and internationally. Um, we're also, from that project, hoping to create a range of digital resources, which we hope will include videos and the actual voices of some of the participants. Again, co-creating and trying to get their voices out there. The second project that we're currently running is the Autistic Voices in Higher Education work-based learning. And that's myself, Dr. Adam Jeffrey and Dr. Steve Rogers, who are academics at Keele, and Mrs. Lou Taylor Murison, who's head of apprenticeships at Keele. And the data collection is very similar to what I've described. It's using Discord. We've currently got 8 participants in one room, and again, we're releasing a series of questions to them across the space of 3 weeks. But all the learners in that room are autistic learners who have a work-based learning element to their higher education, be it apprenticeship or placement, because we sort of thought that an environment other than higher education going into a work environment is potentially going to be a new, potentially difficult space to navigate. And are you going to be getting support from 2 places, higher education and your employer? Are there differences between it, that kind of thing? So that's what we're asking them currently, and we're hoping again to publish on that once we've got the results. So far, we're halfway through the 3 weeks, and some of the data that's coming in again is beautifully honest, really good examples, sometimes upsetting examples, but that's what we want to get those voices out there, and for them to actually tell the stories, even if they are upsetting stories, to raise awareness of what some of autistic learners go through on a day-to-day basis, really.
Wow, it's all amazing news. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And I really do look forward to hearing more about your project in the sort of coming weeks, months, and all the developments that are coming up. And I'm sure our listeners do too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out the rest of our extraordinary Voices of Belonging collection and stay connected.